Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. Now in today's video we're going to be covering the vertebrae, the ribs, the sternum, a large portion of what we call the axial skeleton. We've talked about this before. There's the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton is the center line of the skeletal system. It includes the skull and all of its bones, the hyoid bone, which is underneath your mandible, the vertebrae, the sternum, and the ribs. Everything else would be part of the appendicular skeleton. Now we've covered the skull before, but we need to go over the vertebrae and a few other details. And I like to do this in two videos. One will be me making the drawings so that you see it unfold and can understand it. And then the second video will be of me showing you the actual models, showing you the vertebrae on the models and all the details that you need to see for your lab exams. By the way, if you're watching these videos, you're either enrolled in my class, so learn the structures that I cover, and that are on your list of things to know. Or you're not enrolled in my class, but you stumbled across my video looking for help online. Either way, hit like if you find these videos helpful, and subscribe to it so that you get updates when new videos come in. If you're not in my class, make sure you learn all of the structures that your instructors want you to know. Okay. So now, when it comes to talking about our vertebrae, I'm going to pull a little model over here. I won't say little, I'm going to pull a big model over for a second and have him in the screen here with us. So the skull sits upon the vertebral column, which includes all the vertebrae. And probably from the angle of this camera, you can't see them all, but that's okay. Now, what I want to get across first is how many vertebrae each are there. The region that runs through the neck is the cervical region of the body, so these would be called the cervical vertebrae. And there's 7 cervical vertebrae. As we run through the thoracic cage, through the thorax, there's going to be 12 thoracic vertebrae. And one thing that's unique about the thoracic vertebrae is that they all have a rib attached to them. We have 12 pairs of ribs. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae. When we get past that, the next 5 independent vertebrae are called the lumbar vertebrae. Now, the lumbar vertebrae are in your low back. Okay, so we have cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. 7, 12, and 5. You can remember this little phrase. You have breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, and then dinner at 5. 7, 12, and 5. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar. The next 5 vertebrae get fused together into one structure called the sacrum, and then the last 4 vertebrae get fused together into a structure called the coccyx. Now I'm going to move this guy out of the way because you can't see everything on here anyway, but I wanted you to get an idea of what I was talking about. So, now, when it comes to the vertebrae, you should simply just know this. And some of this will be used for lecture tests very often also. There's a total of 33 in the normal average adult. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral vertebrae, and they are fused into a structure called the sacrum. And then there are 4 what we call coccygeal vertebrae, and they are fused together into one structure. And they form a structure called the coccyx, C-O-C-C-Y-X. Now, when it comes to the vertebrae themselves, the way that they are structured, or the structures of each individual vertebrae, are pretty common for most of these, what we call the free vertebrae or the independent vertebrae. Okay, these are fused, and we'll talk about them when we look at the models. But for these, there are some common traits or common structures that are shared by almost all of these, with the exception of 1 or 2. And we'll learn what those exceptions are. So when I look at the common features of a vertebrae, we can look at it from 2 different angles and see some structures. There's many angles we can look at it from, but one of them is to look down on top of the vertebrae. And I'm just going to draw a generic one here. But there are some structures that stick off like this. And there's a big hole in the vertebrae. I didn't draw that very well, but you get the idea, okay? Now, when it comes to the vertebrae, this structure is referred to as the body of the vertebra, or the vertebral body. Now the big opening in the vertebra is called the vertebral foramen. We learned a long time ago on the skull that foramen means a hole, and that's called the vertebral foramen. And I'm going to put in parentheses the word spinal because it's also called the spinal foramen. That's where the spinal cord is running down, protected by all the vertebrae. Now, the other major structures that I want you to see on this one is this structure back here is called the spinous process. And then these two over here are each called a transverse process. So all of the independent vertebrae, with the exception of one or two, particularly one, will have a body, a vertebral foramen, two transverse processes, and a spinous process. Now there's a couple of other structures that are not on our list, but I want to point them out to you. This little connector from the body out here towards the side is called a pedicle. And then this little structure that makes part of this arch right here is called the lamina. And the only reason I point out the pedicle and the lamina is because when we look at the vertebrae from a lateral view, so I'm going to have the body of a vertebra here, and I'm going to draw a thoracic vertebra. I'm going to draw two of them stacked on top of each other to show you a couple of other structures. Again, not the greatest drawing. I could have done that a little bit better, but now, separating the bodies of the vertebrae is a fibrocartilage pad. We talked about it for lecture, called the intervertebral disc. And so there's a big fibrocartilage pad sitting here, and that's known as the intervertebral disc. Intervertebral means between the vertebrae. And between all the bodies of the vertebrae are these discs. And they act as little shock absorbers. What that does is it creates this opening here, and this hole or opening right here is called the intervertebral foramen. Now the intervertebral foramen can only be formed when two vertebrae are put together. So when I stack them, these structures sticking up and down here are called articular facets. The articular facets are where two vertebrae articulate or form a joint. And if it's on top up here, that would be called the superior articular facet. And the ones on the bottom would be called the inferior articular facet. And each vertebra, although I've labeled them on two different vertebrae, each vertebra has one. So, for this particular vertebra here, I have a superior and an inferior articular facet. For this vertebra, I have a superior and an inferior articular facet. And with the disc and the bodies and these articular facets, when they come together, they form the intervertebral foramen, which is where the nerves exit the spinal cord. And if we damage the disc, you can see how the nerve would get pinched. So from these two views, we can see all of these structures. And also, when someone does get a pinched nerve, one of the things they'll do is called a laminectomy, and they'll shave out part of the lamina to enlarge the hole to relieve the pressure. Okay? So that's why I pointed out the pedicle and the lamina. They're not on your list of things to know for my class, so you don't have to know them for my class. So I'm going to show you some of these structures when we get to the actual models. Now that we've covered the generic structures of all of the vertebrae, you can actually tell which vertebrae you have in your hand when you look at them. So I'm going to go ahead and erase all of this. And we'll start on the next set of information that I want you to know. Now, when it comes to the individual vertebrae, you can tell. Let's say you were on a leisurely walk with a loved one through a park and you find a bunch of bones, a dead body. You can impress them with your knowledge by identifying the different types of vertebrae. Just kidding. So, when it comes to the cervical vertebrae, they have some unique characteristics. when we look at a cervical vertebra, it's usually easy to find them. And I'm just going to put cervical V, the V for vertebra, by looking at them from two angles again. So if we look down on top of them, one of the unique features of cervical vertebra is, or a couple of the unique features of cervical vertebra are this. They still have a body, they have a transverse process and a spinous process and a vertebral foramen. But in their transverse processes, they have additional foramina. And only cervical vertebrae have these that allow these arteries and veins to run up to your skull and out of the skull, called the vertebral arteries and veins. And so that opening that's in the transverse process is called a transverse foramen. And there are two transverse foramina here, okay? The other distinguishing feature, usually, of cervical vertebrae is that they are bifurcated or have a little notch in the spinous process. Now, if I look at them from a lateral view, the bodies are usually pretty small, and the spinous process either sticks straight off or just slightly down. So, if you were to look at one of these, you could easily tell them from all the others because of these characteristics. Now, it will only make a lot more sense when you see it next to a thoracic vertebra, and you'll see what I'm talking about. When it comes to the thoracic vertebrae, a couple of distinguishing features. Number one, their transverse processes angle backwards slightly. They have a larger body, but it's the transverse processes angling backwards. Or if I look at them from a lateral view, one of the things that we note is that their spinous process usually points down. And because they overlap like this, it makes it very hard to bend at the thorax. You can bend your neck because there's room between these spinous processes as they move. But when they're overlapping like this, you can't bend the middle of your back. So you look for this transverse processes pointing backwards, a slightly larger body, and the spinous process pointing in an inferior direction. And then finally of these, we're going to look at this. You're going to look at a lumbar vertebra. When it comes to the lumbar vertebrae, they have a couple of unique characteristics. And really, we don't see much when we look at them from this view, other than they have really large bodies and their transverse processes stick straight off. But from this view, you can see that the bodies get very large, but the spinous process is like a little flat handle, like you can pinch it between your thumb and forefinger. So if you find some vertebrae, you can tell if they're cervical, thoracic, and lumbar by looking for certain characteristics. And we like to ask that on our lab tests. We might ask a question like, identify this part of the vertebra. Which type of vertebra is this? Then you'd have to look at it and tell me, is it cervical, thoracic, or lumbar? If it has 3 holes, it must be cervical. If it looks like a little Teletubby, or it has the transverse processes sticking backwards, or really the spinous process pointing down, it's usually easy to tell that it's thoracic. And then lumbar are very large, and they have a little handle. Now, if you think about it, if we were going to build a pyramid, like when cheerleaders do this, who goes on the bottom, who goes on top? You usually have the lightest, tiniest people at the top, and you have the thickest, strongest people with the most muscle mass at the bottom. The higher up we go, the smaller the bodies are because the less weight they're supporting. The next one should be a little larger, and as we go down, the bodies get bigger and bigger and bigger, supporting more and more weight. Now the last thing I want to show you is this. I'm going to erase all of this, and we're going to talk a little bit about the sacrum and the coccyx, and then I'll show you what the models actually look like. The sacrum, when we look at it, kind of looks like this. And you'll see where the intervertebral foramen were, but they become fused together. There's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vertebrae that all got fused into one large structure. And if I were to look down on top of it this way, I would see that there's an opening in the sacrum I shouldn't do that. That opening where the spinal cord would run is called the sacral canal. When it comes to the coccyx itself, the coccyx is really 4 little individual vertebrae that get fused together. And I'm going to show you what these look like on the model. So, I hope this helped you understand some of the basic structures of the vertebrae, some of the anatomical structures we're going to go over, so that when I show them to you on the model, they'll make a lot more sense. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video, and I hope you had as much fun as I did.